Los Angeles, 1974. Hugh Hefner's private residence was already quiet when the internal phone rang. One short signal. No secretary. No delay. The man on the line did not introduce himself for long. He didn't need to. He spoke from a Senate committee that rarely called private citizens at night. "Tonight, a federal boundary was crossed on your property," he said evenly. "You don't yet understand what that means. By morning, others will." There was no threat in his voice, only certainty. 48 hours later, a reel of film vanished from a Playboy safe, one that was never supposed to exist, let alone disappear. No lock was broken, no alarm sounded, and one of the young women from that night, 22 years old, barely known, left Los Angeles without a trace. No goodbye, no records, just absence. Nothing exploded. No arrests were made. No headlines followed. But from that moment on, the mansion was no longer just a house where powerful people gathered. It became a place the system quietly remembered. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The driveway of the mansion looked calm only from the street. Inside the gates, the light thinned into narrow corridors, and every step echoed longer than it should have. It was late 1974, drifting into the first months of 1975, and the house had already stopped pretending to be just a place for parties. The guards no longer chatted at the entrance. They checked names twice, compared handwriting, memorized faces. Even the laughter from the main hall arrived in fragments, as if the walls themselves were filtering sound. A California senator arrived just before 10. No press, no assistants. His driver stayed in the car, engine running. The senator nodded to the door staff, who did not use his name. Inside, he blended into a crowd that was carefully mixed. Studio executives, two men from a federal contracting firm, a retired naval officer who now consulted for private intelligence outfits, and several young aides who were still unknown enough to move freely. No one wore a badge. That was the point. Around midnight, two men appeared at the side entrance. They showed laminated cards that said, "Federal Consultant." The cards were clean, almost too clean, but the font matched, and the seals looked right in dim light. They were waved through. One of the guards hesitated, then wrote down their names in a separate notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. In a narrow inner room that smelled faintly of chemicals and warm metal, an 8mm camera was set on a small tripod. It did not belong to the house. The operator did not sweep the room. He waited. He framed faces, hands, and brief private moments when people leaned too close to speak. He focused on who stood next to whom, on who disappeared behind closed doors, on who left early, and with whom. The whir of the camera was barely audible, but the smell of fresh film hung in the air like a warning. One of the consultants lingered near him, watching the hallway, fingers resting inside his jacket. Years earlier, he had worked in a private network that had survived the collapse of Watergate by changing names and contracts. He knew exactly what kind of material moved fastest through Washington. Near the back of the room, a young political aide laughed too loudly, unaware that within a year he would hold a seat in Congress. His face filled several frames. Sometime after 2, a guard was asked to help carry a case to a service corridor. He did not know what was inside, but he recognized the lock. By morning, the original reel was no longer in the building. Copies would exist, but not here. The party ended with the usual polite exits and quiet engines. What remained was not confetti or empty glasses, but a thin, invisible line that had just been drawn around the mansion. From that night on, the house was no longer simply hosting influence. It was producing it. And somewhere beyond the gates, the first pieces of leverage were already changing hands. 2 weeks later, the call came through a private line that almost never rang. It bypassed the receptionist and lit a small amber indicator on the desk in Hefner's study. The voice on the other end was calm, practiced, and unmistakably Washington. A senator who had walked the mansion's corridors more than once did not threaten, did not accuse. He said only that federal channels had picked up noise about unauthorized recordings connected to a private event in Los Angeles. He advised discretion, as if recommending a quieter brand of wine. Hefner listened without interruption. When the line went dead, he did not move for several minutes. His expression did not change, but the room felt tighter, as though the walls had leaned inward. He summoned his legal counsel before noon. By the afternoon, a second message arrived, this one through an entertainment attorney who often bridged Hollywood and defense contractors. One of the young women from the same night, officially listed as a freelance model, was not what her file suggested. She was the daughter of a senior Pentagon subcontractor whose companies supplied communications hardware overseas. Her presence had not been accidental. Her family name was never spoken out loud, but it did not need to be. The lawyers began a quiet audit. No alarms were tripped. No drawers were forced. Yet one internal safe showed a clean access mark from the night in question. The mechanism had been opened with a master sequence, the kind used only by 2 people in the building. Both denied touching it. The original reel that might have proved what was filmed, and by whom, was gone. Within 48 hours, Hefner was presented with a short briefing memo compiled from informal Capitol Hill conversations. It carried a phrase that would soon circulate in hushed offices. Playboy is no longer media. It is a risk zone. No logo. No letterhead. Just a sentence. Dry and precise. At the same time, a familiar guest who had long treated the mansion as a neutral meeting ground accepted a transfer to Washington. His new title placed him inside a department that quietly tracked preliminary inquiries long before they became official investigations. He sent a polite farewell note, handwritten, thanking Hefner for years of hospitality. Hefner did not respond. Instead, he began to map who spoke to whom, which corridors were busiest, and which rooms were too quiet. He asked for a revised guest log system. He ordered a review of private security contracts. He stopped approving new faces on short notice. There was no panic in his instructions, only narrowing focus. The missing reel could have cleared him. Its absence did the opposite. Somewhere, copies existed without context, detached from any defense he might mount. They were not meant for courtrooms. They were meant for leverage. By the end of the week, the mansion was no longer just a place people visited. It had become a node in a network Hefner could sense, but not see. He did not retreat. He adjusted his footing, aware that the ground had already shifted beneath him. She was 22, recently arrived in Los Angeles, and still careful about how she pronounced her own name. On paper, she existed in the mansion's records for less than a year. A handful of test shoots, 2 private dinners, 1 invitation that mattered more than all the others combined. After that night, her name stopped appearing anywhere that could be searched without permission. Her apartment near Franklin Avenue was vacated in silence. Rent paid through the end of the month. No forwarding address. The neighbor remembered a late car, dark sedan, engine off while boxes were loaded quickly. No argument. No raised voices. Just efficiency. By the time anyone thought to ask, the space was already repainted. Inside Playboy's internal files, her entry was amended twice. First marked inactive, then removed entirely. A legal assistant, instructed not to ask questions, shredded the paper version and replaced it with a placeholder code that meant nothing on its own. Hefner saw the change and did not comment. 3 weeks later, she reappeared on the East Coast under a different surname, New Jersey. A consulting firm that described itself as a social dynamics advisor for defense-adjacent corporations added her to its staff page. No photo. Her listed education was vague but sufficient. Her role involved accompanying executives to events, reading rooms, guiding conversations away from risk. She learned quickly. The women who had shared drinks with her that night each received identical letters from different law firms. Polite language, firm deadlines, no accusations, just reminders of confidentiality obligations tied to prior agreements. None of them challenged it. Silence was easier to maintain than curiosity. What was not erased was her earlier connection to one of the men who had arrived with federal credentials. They had met months before, through an intermediary who specialized in introductions that were useful but forgettable. She had understood that her value was not beauty, but proximity. Her disappearance coincided with the first informal inquiry circulating through congressional offices about undeclared political gathering spaces in California. No subpoenas, no hearings, just a classification exercise. Who hosted? Who attended? Who controlled access? The mansion's name appeared, then stalled. Within days, new rules were quietly enforced at the house. No personal cameras, no exceptions. New guests required direct approval. The corridors felt emptier, the laughter shorter. The staff adjusted without explanation. She was not a victim in the traditional sense. She had stepped into a game that extended far beyond the gates, recognized the moment when the board revealed itself, and accepted relocation as a form of survival. In New Jersey, she learned to speak less and listen more. In Los Angeles, people learned not to ask where she had gone. What lingered was not grief, but absence. A clean removal that signaled something larger had locked into place. The mansion continued to function, but with a colder precision. Whatever had been set in motion that night no longer needed spectacle. It operated best without witnesses. By 1976, observation was no longer enough. The system did not knock. It found side doors and walked in without leaving footprints. The first contact came wrapped as a favor. A polite request relayed through a Justice Department intermediary who emphasized there was no warrant, no formal action, only an interest in clarifying misunderstandings. The implication was heavier than any subpoena. Another request followed, this time from an FBI liaison who did not put anything in writing. He asked to review guest protocols, security procedures, and archival practices. He used careful language, repeating that Hefner himself was not under scrutiny. The inquiry, he said, concerned emerging patterns of political interaction in private spaces. Hefner understood immediately. The mansion was not the target. It was the access point. An internal attorney delivered an unsettling detail during a closed meeting. A case file existed. It had a number, an internal classification, and a circulation list. Yet there was no official case, no complaint, no initiating document, just a container waiting to be filled if circumstances demanded it. Through discreet channels, Hefner learned how the copied recordings were moving. Not toward prosecutors, toward negotiators. Fragments were exchanged between rival political groups as proof of vulnerability, not guilt. The material functioned as currency, its value derived from uncertainty rather than evidence. The mansion's walls had never been mentioned by name, but everyone involved knew the origin. Publicly, the contrast was stark. Playboy was still defended as free expression, challenged by moral crusaders, debated on television panels. Privately, its address was appearing in memoranda under a different label. One document described it as a high-risk convergence site. Another referred to it as an informal aggregation zone for elite actors. The word club never appeared. The irony sharpened when a senator who had attended the night in question emerged as a vocal supporter of anti-pornography legislation. His speeches were clean, disciplined. He requested private meetings with Hefner through intermediaries, never acknowledging prior familiarity. The conversations were courteous and brief, always ending with reminders about shared interests in stability. Hefner was not charged, questioned under oath, or summoned. He was instead enclosed by procedure. Every interaction came with a suggested framework. Every suggestion carried consequences that were never spelled out. He complied selectively, offering transparency where it cost little, withholding where it mattered most. There were no raids, no raised voices, only paper trails that hinted at futures that could be activated at will. Hefner understood that resistance would transform him into a symbol, and symbols were easy to dismantle. Cooperation, carefully limited, kept him operational but constrained. The mansion remained open, its gates still guarded, its rooms still occupied. Yet something fundamental had shifted. It was no longer a stage. It was a monitored environment. Hefner moved through it aware that the rules were now written elsewhere, by people who did not need to enter the building to control it. The first clear sign did not come from Washington. It came from a discrepancy that should not have existed. A guest list from early spring failed to match the security shift logs. Names appeared in one record and vanished in another. No errors were noted. No corrections requested. Someone had been editing the mansion's memory from the inside. Hefner ordered a silent review. Not an investigation, not yet. Patterns emerged quickly. One senior operations manager, present for years and trusted for discretion, appeared repeatedly at the edges of sensitive moments. He approved last-minute entries. He reassigned guards without explanation. He handled document storage on nights when important people arrived quietly. When confronted, the man did not deny it. He did not raise his voice or plead. He explained, methodically, that cooperation had been presented as protection. No ideology, no loyalty shift. Just a guarantee that his name would never surface in connection with future inquiries. In exchange, he passed along schedules, guest profiles, and summaries of private conversations. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal on its own. Enough to complete other people's files. Through him, entire attendance histories had reached a federal analytical unit that specialized in mapping influence networks. Not to accuse, to understand leverage. Soon after, several familiar figures stopped attending altogether. They did not call. They did not cancel. They simply received advice that other venues were safer. The man added one more detail before leaving the room. The initial call from the Senate, the one framed as a courtesy, had not been protection. It was a sorting mechanism. Hefner had been given an opportunity to contain damage quietly. Others had not been so fortunate. They didn't want to break you, the manager said, choosing his words carefully. They wanted you predictable. Hefner dismissed him without ceremony. No threats, no public firing. He understood that outrage would be useless. What mattered was the realization settling in. His organization was no longer autonomous. It was embedded. That night, he walked the grounds alone. The house was quiet, almost respectful. He considered the obvious response, defiance, exposure, confrontation, and discarded it just as quickly. Turning Playboy into a battlefield would not wound the system. It would make him an example. By morning, he had made a decision he did not announce. Contracts would change. Access would tighten. Certain kinds of guests would no longer be welcome, though no rule would ever say so outright. The mansion would survive, but it would no longer pretend to host power on equal terms. The danger was no longer outside the gates. It had already shaped the walls. And Hefner, for the first time, understood that staying alive in this game required something more difficult than resistance: controlled silence. By the end of the decade, the pressure no longer arrived as questions. It arrived as options. A former federal attorney, now operating as a private intermediary, requested a discreet meeting away from the mansion. No assistance. No notes. The man spoke in conditionals and hypotheticals, the language of someone used to agreements that were never signed. There would be no indictments, no public hearings, no formal acknowledgement that anything improper had ever occurred. In return, the mansion would stop functioning as a crossroads. Not officially, gradually. Guest lists would narrow. Political figures would fade out. Certain doors would remain closed without explanation. The brand would survive, but the terrain around it would be redrawn. Hefner understood the offer immediately. It was not mercy. It was efficiency. The system had no interest in spectacle when compliance achieved the same result. Refusal, on the other hand, would invite a lesson for the entire entertainment industry. He agreed without shaking hands. The changes began quietly. Long-standing security contracts were terminated and replaced with a smaller, internally loyal team. Surveillance protocols were tightened, then simplified. Fewer eyes, fewer records. Invitations were no longer spontaneous. Names that once guaranteed access now stalled at the gate, politely deferred, indefinitely. Unwritten rules replaced old habits. Sitting politicians were no longer present after midnight. Fundraisers found other venues. Conversations that once drifted toward influence redirected themselves back to entertainment. Playboy shifted its weight toward publishing, licensing, and controlled appearances. The nights grew quieter, safer, less valuable to anyone seeking leverage. Some of the copied material vanished entirely. Files misclassified, reels misplaced, archives sealed under layers of bureaucratic inertia. Other fragments remained buried, preserved not for use, but for balance. Insurance that no one intended to cash. The senator who had made the first call years earlier exited public life without scandal. No memoir, no investigation. A clean departure that confirmed what Hefner already knew. The arrangement had been honored. What he lost was harder to name. Not money, not visibility. It was the unspoken understanding that the mansion had once operated outside the system's immediate reach. That illusion was gone. The house still stood. The parties still happened. But the current had shifted. Power no longer passed through the rooms. It flowed around them. Hefner accepted this with the discipline of a pragmatist. Survival required adaptation, not nostalgia. He had not surrendered. He had recalibrated. And in doing so, he ensured that nothing like that night would ever happen there again. Not because it was forbidden, but because it was no longer useful. By the early 1990s, the mansion still appeared intact to anyone arriving for the first time. The gates opened smoothly. The guards were polite, professional, almost ceremonial. Inside, laughter floated across the lawns, and the lights stayed warm well into the night. What newcomers could not sense was what no longer moved through the building. Certain rooms were permanently closed, not repurposed, not renovated, simply sealed. Staff were told they were structurally unsound, though no repairs were ever scheduled. Younger guests occasionally asked about them and received vague answers that carried no curiosity forward. Curiosity itself had learned where to stop. Playboy continued as a brand, louder in some ways, broader in reach. The magazine adapted. The business diversified. Public controversies came and went, none of them touching the core of what had once made the mansion dangerous. That era had ended cleanly, without a headline. A freelance journalist, years later, stumbled across a minor federal document while researching unrelated procurement records. Buried in an appendix was a name, misfiled, misspelled, and never explained. It matched the vanished woman from that long-ago night. No follow-up, no narrative, just a reference that led nowhere. The journalist mentioned it once to an editor and was advised to focus on something publishable. Hefner, older now, mentioned the past only once, in private, to someone he trusted. His voice was steady, almost detached. "The most dangerous parties," he said, "are the ones where everyone believes they're untouchable." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The truth was simple and unsatisfying. No one was exposed. No careers collapsed publicly. The system absorbed its own risk and neutralized it quietly. Those who mattered adjusted. Those who did not disappeared from relevance. Order was restored without punishment. The mansion survived precisely because it stopped being useful to real power. What replaced influence was performance. What replaced leverage was image. The house became a symbol again, not a node. On a quiet night, decades removed from the event that reshaped everything, the grounds were still. Security stood at their posts. Cameras monitored only what they were meant to see. No unauthorized equipment, no improvised access, no ambiguity. The night passed without incident, and that was the point. Some scandals end with noise, others end with silence so complete it becomes permanent. What happened there was never erased. It was contained, archived, and left untouched, remembered only by the few who understood that crossing certain lines does not invite chaos, it invites control.